I'm not a virgin, slave woman said. Rancher held her and said, I never asked you to be. In the dusty town square, a woman broken by chains dares to speak the truth, and the crowd roars with cruel laughter. But one battle-scarred rancher steps forward, not to shame her, but to set her free. His words silence the street and bind their fates together. Yet in a land ruled by greed and power, freedom is never safe. A ruthless rancher claims her as his property, flashing forged papers and setting the town against them. Fire will burn, gunmen will ride, and even the church will turn them away. But hidden inside her worn Bible lies the one truth that could save them both, if she has the courage to stand and speak it before the law. Will love and faith be enough to shatter the chains of hatred? Or will the past drag them back into bondage forever? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more. Through the gray morning mist, the wagon wheels creaked along the rutted road leading out of Mason Creek. Nancy sat rigid on the wooden seat, her thin shawl now covered by Timothy Townsend's weathered coat. The warmth of the wool brought little comfort as her mind raced with questions about the stranger beside her. The clop of horse hooves marked time with her heartbeat. She stole careful glances at her owner, savior, the man who had just spent his savings to claim her at auction. Timothy kept his eyes on the road, his rough hands steady on the reins. The deep lines around his mouth and the silver threading his dark hair spoke of hard years, while the way he favored his left leg told of old wounds. There's hot coffee in that jug by your feet, Timothy said, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet but clear, like creek water over stones. Might help ward off the December chill. Nancy hesitated, then reached for the ceramic jug. The coffee was strong and sweet with molasses. The familiar taste brought tears to her eyes that she quickly blinked away. Much obliged, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. No need for thanks, Timothy replied. He shifted slightly, easing pressure off his bad leg. That crowd back there, they had no right treating you that way. Nancy's fingers tightened around the warm jug. The memory of those sneering faces, the cruel laughter when she'd spoken her truth, made shame burn in her chest. But beneath it stirred something else, pride, perhaps at having faced them with her head high. I won't be made to lie, she said, not anymore. Timothy nodded, a slight smile touching the corner of his mouth. Truth's got more value than pretty falsehoods. Learned that the hard way in the war. They rode in silence for a while, the town falling away behind them. The Texas landscape rolled out ahead, winter-brown grass dotted with scraggly mesquite, dry creek beds cutting through rocky soil. A raw land, Nancy thought, but one that held promise of spring. My ranch is about 10 miles ahead, Timothy said. It ain't much to look at these days. War years were hard, and the drought's been worse. But there's a solid roof, good well water, and work enough to keep busy. Nancy straightened her shoulders. I know ranch work, Mr. Townsend. Can cook, clean, mend clothes, whatever's needed. Just Timothy, he corrected gently. And you'll have your own room in the house. Door that locks. No one will bother you there. The words hung in the air between them. Nancy felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen, just a fraction. A door that locked. Such a simple thing, but one that spoke volumes about the man beside her. Why? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Why spend your savings on me? Could have bought 2 strong field hands for that price. Timothy was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice carried the weight of lived truth. After Gettysburg, I lay in a field hospital for weeks. Surgeon wanted to take my leg, but a colored nurse, Freeman's daughter, she fought to save it. Cleaned my wounds every day. Prayed over me when the fever raged. He tapped his cane where it rested against the seat. Still carry Confederate lead, but I kept my leg. Never got to thank her proper. She died when typhus swept through the camp. He cleared his throat roughly. Reckon sometimes the good Lord gives us chances to pay old debts. Not that you need my help, saw how you stood up to those men. But maybe we can help each other. Ranch needs tending, and I ain't too proud to admit I could use the company. Nancy studied his profile, seeing past the scars and where to something that made her heart ache, loneliness as deep as her own. She knew then that whatever his reasons, this was no act of mere charity or masked intentions. This was something. Rarer, human kindness offered without strings. The wagon crested a small rise, and Timothy pointed ahead. There it is. Townsend Ranch. Nancy saw a weather-beaten house surrounded by split-rail fencing, a barn in need of fresh paint, and corrals that wanted mending. But smoke rose straight and true from the chimney, and she could make out a small kitchen garden, no winter bare now. Not much to look at, Timothy had said, but Nancy saw something else, possibility. Tell me about the nurse, she said softly. The one who saved your leg. I'd like to know her name. Timothy's hands relaxed slightly on the reins. Sarah. Her name was Sarah Collins. She used to sing hymns while she worked, had the sweetest voice I ever heard. My mama was named Sarah, Nancy said, the words coming easier now. She taught me every hymn she knew before they sold her away. Timothy glanced at her, understanding in his eyes. Would you sing one, if you've a mind to? Nancy looked ahead at the approaching ranch, her new home, perhaps. The morning mist was beginning to lift, and weak winter sunlight touched the bare branches of a lone oak tree in the yard. She thought of her mama, of Sarah Collins, of all the strong women who had lifted their voices in dark times. Softly at first. Then, with growing strength, she began to sing Amazing Grace. Timothy's voice joined hers on the second verse, rough but true, their harmony carrying across the winter-touched land as the wagon rolled home. The sound of their blended voices seemed to warm the chill air, and Nancy felt something shift inside. Her, not trust, not yet, but its first tender seedling. Here was a man who had seen her strength rather than her scars, who had offered dignity when others dealt in shame. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it with the same courage that had let her speak truth in that town square as they approached. The ranch gate, Timothy carefully set the brake and climbed down, his movements stiff but determined as he limped around to help her from the wagon. She didn't need the assistance but accepted his offered hand, feeling the honest calluses of hard work in his palm. Welcome home, Miss Nancy, he said simply, then turned to open the gate. Home. Such a weighted word, one she'd learned to be wary of. But watching Timothy swing the gate wide, Nancy allowed herself to hope. Not all chains were made of iron, she knew. Some were forged of fear, of mistrust, of wounds too deep to name. But here, perhaps, was a chance to break them, link by link, day by day. She stepped through the gate, head high, ready to begin. The wagon wheels crunched over frozen ground as Timothy guided them toward the ranch. Late December shadows stretched long across the Texas plains, and the air carried the sharp scent of cedar smoke from distant chimneys. Nancy pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders, watching as their destination grew closer with each passing minute. The ranch itself spoke of hard times and neglect. A barn listed slightly to one side, its weathered boards gray with age. The main house seemed to bow under winter's heavy hand, its porch sporting missing boards and a roof that needed attention. Split-rail fences marked the boundaries, but many posts had worked loose in their holes, leaving gaps that would need mending come spring. Timothy cleared his throat. It ain't much to look at right now, he said, his voice carrying a note of apology. War took its toll, and times have been lean since. Nancy nodded, taking in every detail. She'd learned long ago to read places like she read people, looking for signs of character beneath the surface. Despite its worn appearance, she noted the neat woodpile stacked against the barn, the swept yard, the careful repair to a broken window. Someone who still cared, even if they lacked means. The wagon creaked to a stop near the house. Timothy climbed down carefully, favoring his bad leg, and reached for a lantern hanging from a hook. The match flared bright in the gathering dusk, and warm light spilled across the yard. He offered his hand to help her down, but didn't press when she managed on her own. Kitchen's warm, he said, leading the way. Keep the stove going most days. Inside, the kitchen was plain but clean. A cast-iron cook-stove radiated welcome heat, and Nancy's trained eye noted the basic implements hanging from pegs, skillets, pots, a few wooden spoons worn smooth with use. A rough-hewn table with 4 chairs stood in the center, its surface scrubbed but marked by years of use. Timothy set the lantern on the table, then seemed to struggle for words. His fingers worried the handle of his cane. Miss Nancy, I should explain proper why I brought you here. She tensed slightly, waiting for the other shoe to drop. In her experience, white men's explanations rarely ended well for women who looked like her. "Truth is," he continued, "I need help running this place. Cooking, mending, tending to the cattle when I can't manage alone." He gestured to his leg. "Some days are harder than others with this old wound. Been trying to keep up, but," he trailed off, shaking his head. "And that's all?" Nancy asked carefully, testing his words. Timothy met her gaze directly. "That's all. You'll have fair wages, your own space. Whatever work you're willing to do, I'm grateful for. Whatever you're not comfortable with, you don't have to do." Nancy studied him, looking for any sign of deception. But his face remained open, honest in its weariness. "I'll fix us some supper," he said, moving to the pantry. "Not much tonight, salt pork and beans. Tomorrow we can see about proper groceries." She watched as he gathered simple supplies, noting how he winced when reaching for the bean pot on a high shelf. Without comment, she stepped forward and took it from him. He nodded thanks, and they worked in silence, him building up the stove's fire, her sorting through what she needed to prepare the meal. When the food was ready, Timothy bowed his head before eating. "Lord," he prayed softly, "thank you for this food and for second chances. Amen." Nancy paused with her spoon halfway to her mouth. Second chances? Was he referring to himself or to her? The prayer left her puzzled, adding another layer to the mystery of this quiet man who'd spent his savings to help a stranger. After they'd eaten and cleaned up, Timothy lifted the lantern again. "Let me show you where you'll sleep." He led her down a short hallway to a small bedroom. A narrow bed with a faded quilt stood against one wall, a chest of drawers against another. A window looked out over the back pasture, its curtains thin but clean. "Was my mother's room?" Timothy said quietly. "She passed 5 years ago. Everything's fresh. New sheets, blankets. Door has a good lock." He set the lantern on the dresser. "Bathroom's down the hall. I'm across the way if you need anything, but I won't disturb you." With that, he bid her good night and left her alone. Nancy stood in the middle of the room, trying to make sense of it all. No conditions. No demands. Just a bedroom with a lock on the door and the promise of honest work. She unpacked her few possessions, handling her mother's Bible last. The worn book had seen her through the worst of times, its pages holding both comfort and the carefully hidden letters she'd learned in secret. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she clutched it to her chest, listening to the settling sounds of the old house. Through the thin wall, she heard Timothy moving in his room. A deep cough rattled his chest, the kind that spoke of old damage, perhaps from the same war that had lammed his leg. The sound should have made her nervous, a man's presence so close. Instead, she felt an unexpected sense of security. Holding her Bible tighter, Nancy considered her situation. Either Timothy Townsend was the biggest fool she'd ever met, spending his savings on a former slave woman with a reputation, or he was truly what he appeared, a decent man offering honest work and safe shelter. Both seemed equally improbable. In her experience, another cough from next door, followed by the creak of bed springs as Timothy settled for the night. Nancy found herself hoping, against all her careful instincts, that he was indeed the blessing he appeared to be. She'd learned to be wary of white men's kindness, but something about Timothy's quiet dignity, his simple prayer for second chances, made her want to believe. The lantern flame flickered, casting gentle shadows on the walls of what might become her first real home since freedom. Nancy opened her Bible, finding comfort in its familiar words as she had so many nights before. But tonight, for the first time in years, she read not for escape, but for guidance. Perhaps God had led her here for a reason, to this broken down ranch and its wounded owner who treated her with such unexpected respect. Outside, a cold wind rattled the window pane. But inside, the house was warm, and Nancy felt the first tentative stirrings of hope in her heart. The first pale light of dawn crept through Nancy's window, accompanied by the distant lowing of cattle. She stirred beneath the warm quilt, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar creaks and settling sounds of the old ranch house. The aroma of fresh coffee drifted under her door, rich and inviting. Nancy dressed quickly in her simple cotton dress, shivering in the morning chill. As she stepped into the hallway, she found a thick wool shawl draped over a chair, with a note in Timothy's careful handwriting, "Might need this." Cold morning. She hesitated before wrapping the borrowed shawl around her shoulders. The wool was well worn but clean, carrying the faint scent of cedar from the storage chest. Such quiet consideration from a stranger still felt foreign to her. Outside, frost coated the ground, crunching beneath her boots. The sun hadn't yet cleared the eastern hills, but Timothy was already at work by the corral. His breath clouded in the cold air as he limped along the fence line, tossing feed to the restless steers. The cattle pushed and jostled, their backs steaming in the morning chill. Timothy looked up at her approach, touching the brim of his hat. "Morning, Miss Nancy. Sleep well." "Yes, thank you," she replied, pulling the shawl tighter. "What needs doing?" He reached behind the feed barrel and produced a wooden bucket. "Chickens need feeding if you're willing. They get mighty vocal when breakfast's late." As if to prove his point, an impatient chorus of clucking rose from the chicken coop. Nancy accepted the bucket, finding it filled with cracked corn and grain. Timothy demonstrated how to scatter the feed in a wide arc, keeping the hungry hens from crowding too close. "Just like this," he said, tossing a handful. "Though I reckon you'll find your own way of doing it before long." They settled into their morning tasks without much talk. Nancy found comfort in the quiet rhythm, the scratch of chicken feet, the swish of grain through air, the distant lowing of cattle. It reminded her of dawns long ago, before everything changed, when work had purpose beyond serving another's gain. The morning passed steadily. When the outdoor chores were done, Nancy turned her attention to the kitchen. She found cornmeal in the pantry and set about making breakfast cakes, working from memory of countless mornings cooking for others. The familiar motions came naturally. Mixing, patting, watching the cakes brown on the hot griddle. Timothy's heavy step paused in the doorway. "That smells mighty fine," he said, surprise evident in his voice. Nancy glanced up from her work. "Used to cook for a household of 12, she said simply, flipping a perfectly brown cake. Learned to make do with what was on hand. They ate at the kitchen table, the fresh cakes drizzled with the last of Timothy's molasses. He cleared his throat. "Been a long while since I had proper cooking," he admitted. "Much obliged." As evening approached, Timothy worked on replacing a broken fence post near the house. Nancy watched from the kitchen window as he struggled with the heavy timber, his bad leg clearly paining him though he pressed on. She had found his torn work shirt while tidying earlier and now sat mending it by lamplight, her neat stitches closing the ragged tear. The shirt told its own story, patched and rewashed countless times, but clean and carefully stored. Like everything else she'd observed about Timothy Townsend, it spoke of pride without pretense, of making do with dignity. After a simple supper of beans and salt pork, Timothy reached for his Bible. The leather binding was smooth with age and use. He opened it carefully, pages rustling in the quiet kitchen. "Hope you don't mind," he said. "Got in the habit of reading a bit before bed. Helps settle the mind." Nancy nodded, her own Bible safely tucked away upstairs. Timothy's voice was rough but steady as he read from Psalms, the familiar words filling the kitchen with their ancient comfort. She kept her face carefully neutral, though the verses touched something deep within her, memories of secret prayers, of faith sustained through darkest nights. Later, preparing for bed, Nancy felt the weight of silence in the old house. How many years had it stood this way, she wondered. Rooms empty of family, no voices raised in conversation or laughter. The thought stirred something in her chest, a familiar ache of displacement and loss. Almost without thinking, she began to hum softly, an old hymn her mother had sung in quiet moments. The melody grew stronger, though she kept her voice low, the words coming back to her like old friends. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Through the thin wall, Timothy lay still, listening. The gentle notes drifted through the house like a blessing, easing the constant ache in his wounded leg. He closed his eyes, letting Nancy's clear voice wash over him, carrying away the loneliness of too many silent nights. In her room, Nancy continued singing softly, her fingers tracing the worn cover of her Bible. The house felt different now, as if the simple sharing of work and meals, scripture and song, had begun to warm its empty spaces. Not home, not yet, but perhaps a place where trust could grow. Slow and steady as the sunrise. Sunday dawned clear and cold, frost glazing the withered grass. Nancy smoothed her best dress, faded but clean, and pinned her hair carefully. Through the window, she watched Timothy hitching the horses to the wagon, his movements slow and deliberate in his Sunday clothes. The morning sun caught the silver in his hair as he worked, making him look older than his years. His clean white shirt stood stark against the weathered fence posts, and his usually mud-caked boots had been polished to a dull shine. Even his cane, normally dusty from ranch work, had been wiped clean. Nancy's hands trembled slightly as she tied her bonnet. She hadn't set foot in a proper church since before the war, when she'd huddled in the slave gallery, forbidden to take communion with the white congregation. Now here she was, preparing to walk through the front door beside Timothy Townsend. The wagon wheels creaked as Timothy guided the team down the rutted road toward Mason Creek. Neither spoke much, but Nancy noticed how he kept glancing her way, as if checking that she hadn't changed her mind about coming. The town's church spire rose above the trees, a simple white clapboard building with a copper bell that rang across the valley dot as Timothy helped her down from the wagon. His strong hand steady at her waist, the first whispers started. Women on the church steps drew back, their faces pinched with disapproval. Men paused in their conversations, watching with hard eyes as Timothy and Nancy approached. "Ain't right," someone muttered. "Man ought to know better." Nancy felt every stir like a physical touch as they walked up the wooden steps. Timothy's hand rested lightly at her elbow, guiding her forward. The morning sun through the windows cast rainbow shadows from the colored glass, but there was no warmth in the sanctuary. Pews creaked and shifted as they entered. Neighbors who normally greeted Timothy with friendly nods now turned away. A woman pulled her child closer as they passed. Nancy kept her eyes forward, though her cheeks burned with shame and anger. They settled into a back pew, the wood smooth from generations of Sunday worshipers. Timothy placed his Bible between them, its pages well-worn and marked with strips of cloth. The organ wheezed to life, and Nancy let the familiar hymns wash over her. Though she dared not sing above a whisper, the service proceeded with rigid formality. The pastor's sermon spoke of order and propriety, his gaze never quite reaching their corner. When communion time came, the silver trays of bread and wine began their solemn journey down the rows. Nancy's heart pounded as the deacon approached their pew. She saw his hands falter, saw the moment of decision in his eyes. Then he passed them by, moving to the next row as if they were invisible. The rejection was swift and absolute. A low murmur rippled through the congregation. Nancy lowered her head, her throat tight with unshed tears. But beside her, Timothy stirred. His chair scraped against the floor as he rose, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "The Lord's table is for sinners," he declared, his tone firm but gentle. "And I reckon that includes me." The silence that followed was absolute. Nancy could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every shocked stare. Timothy's hand found hers, warm and calloused, and he helped her to her feet. Together they walked down the center aisle, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. Outside, the morning sun was blindingly bright. A cluster of children stood frozen on the church steps, staring openly at them. But as Nancy and Timothy passed, Samuel Hollis, one of the older deacons, deliberately removed his hat and inclined his head respectfully. The simple gesture felt like cool water in a desert. The wagon ride home seemed longer than the journey. Nancy sat rigid beside Timothy, fighting back tears of humiliation and rage. The proud set of his shoulders never wavered as he guided the horses, his presence solid and reassuring beside her. Back at the ranch, the day passed in heavy silence. Nancy went through her usual tasks mechanically, feeding chickens, preparing their evening meal. As dusk settled over the land, she ladled hot stew into bowls and set them on the kitchen table. They ate without speaking, the quiet broken only by the clink of spoons and the distant cry of a whippoorwill. Finally, Nancy set down her spoon and looked directly at Timothy. "Why did you do it?" she asked softly. "Why defy the whole church for my sake?" Timothy considered her question carefully, his weathered face thoughtful in the lamplight. "Because truth matters more than men's scorn," he said at last. "And the truth is, we're all God's children, no matter what some folks might say." For the first time since that morning, Nancy felt the tight knot in her chest begin to loosen. A small smile tugged at her lips, tentative at first, then growing stronger as Timothy's words sank in. He had stood up not just to defend her, but to defend what was right. In that moment, their fragile bond deepened into something more lasting than mere convenience or necessity. The lamplight cast soft shadows across the kitchen as they finished their meal, but the silence between them had changed. It was no longer heavy with hurt and rejection, but peaceful, the quiet of two people who understood each other a little better than before. Outside, a cold wind rattled the window panes, but inside the kitchen remained warm and sheltered. Nancy gathered their empty bowls, her movements unhurried now. Timothy's quiet strength had steadied her, helping her stand tall against the judgment of others. Whatever came next, she knew she wasn't facing it alone. The weak winter sun hung high in the afternoon, sky as Nancy pinned sheets to the clothesline. The crisp December wind snapped the wet fabric, making it dance like pale flags against the blue backdrop. Her fingers, red from the cold water, worked quickly to secure each corner before the next gust could tear it away. The steady rhythm of hoofbeats drew her attention to the road. A rider approached, his black stallion kicking up dust despite the frozen ground. Nancy's hand stilled on the damp cloth as she recognized the man, Cade Broderick, whose sprawling ranch bordered Timothy's modest spread to the north. Broderick sat tall in his tooled leather saddle, his clothes speaking of wealth that seemed out of place in Mason Creek. His silver spurs caught the sunlight as he reined his horse to a stop near the fence. The sneer beneath his trimmed mustache made Nancy's stomach clench. "Afternoon, girl," he called out, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. His eyes raked over her like she was livestock at auction. "Seems we need to have us a conversation." "About property rights." Nancy's throat went dry. She'd seen that look before, in the eyes of men who thought they could own people. Her fingers clutched the rough wood of the clothespin as Broderick reached into his coat. The screen door creaked, and Timothy stepped out onto the porch. His revolver hung at his hip, secured in its worn leather holster. Though he leaned on his cane, his stance was solid as granite. "State your business, Broderick," Timothy said, his voice level but firm. Cade's smile widened as he pulled out a sheaf of papers, waving them like a flag of victory. "Just coming to claim what's mine by law, Townsend. These here papers show this woman's my rightful property, ran away during the war. Sheriff's got copies too." The blood drained from Nancy's face. Her legs trembled as memories of chains and whips flashed through her mind. "No," she whispered, though the word barely carried past her lips. Timothy's jaw tightened as he made his way down the porch steps. "The war's been over 11 years, he said. "Nancy's a free woman. Those papers don't mean anything now." "That so?" Broderick's voice dripped with false concern. He turned in his saddle, addressing someone Nancy hadn't noticed before. "What do you say to that, Sheriff?" Sheriff Greeley sat uncomfortably on his bay mare in the shadow of a cedar tree. His badge caught the sun as he shifted his weight, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. "I'll have to look into it proper," he mumbled. "Check the laws, see what's what." "You do that," Broderick said, his tone making it clear he expected a favorable ruling. He thrust the papers toward Timothy. "Meanwhile, you best think hard about where you stand, Townsend. Law's the law, even out here." Timothy didn't take the offered documents. "Nancy stays here," he said quietly. "Free and protected under God's law, if not man's." Broderick's face darkened. He tucked the papers away with deliberate slowness, his eyes never leaving Timothy's face. "We'll see about that. Sheriff, I trust you'll do your duty when the time comes." With that, he wheeled his horse around, the animal's hooves throwing up clods of frozen earth. Before riding off, he fixed Nancy with one last penetrating stare. "Best pack your things, girl. You'll be coming home soon enough." The sheriff lingered. A moment longer, his discomfort plain on his weathered face. "Tim," he began, "you know how things are. Broderick's got influence with the circuit judge, and those papers look mighty official." "Good day, Sheriff." Timothy cut him off, his tone brooking no argument. Greeley touched his hat brim and turned his horse to follow. Broderick's dust trail back toward town. Nancy stood rooted by the clothesline until the riders disappeared around the bend. Only then did her legs give way, sending her to her knees. In the frozen grass, the sheet she'd been hanging billowed around her like a ghost. Timothy was at her side in an instant, helping her to her feet with gentle hands. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's get you inside where it's warm." The rest of the afternoon passed in a fog of fear. Nancy went through her usual tasks mechanically, finishing the laundry, preparing supper, feeding the chickens, but her hands shook at every shadow. As darkness fell, she sat by the fireplace, watching the flames dance while terror gnawed at her insides. Timothy brought her a cup of hot tea, setting it carefully beside her chair. "The law will prove your freedom," he said, though his voice held less certainty than his words. "Those papers can't be genuine. The war ended too long ago." Nancy wrapped her fingers around the warm cup. "The sheriff won't help," she whispered. "I saw it in his eyes. He's afraid of Broderick." "Most folks are," Timothy admitted, settling into his own chair with a grimace of pain. "Man's got money and connections. Builds his power on others' fear." They ate their supper in troubled silence. Afterward, Timothy remained at the table, his scarred hands spread flat on the worn wood. Nancy watched as his fingers traced old wounds, white lines that spoke of battles fought long ago. His eyes had grown distant, seeing ghosts of war days when might made right, and justice bowed before power. The familiar weight of helplessness pressed down on Nancy's chest. But something else stirred beneath it, something that had been sleeping since the day her chains first fell away. She closed her eyes and, for the first time since freedom came, lifted her voice in prayer. "Lord," she began softly, her words trembling at first but growing stronger, "hold us fast in your hands. Shield us from those who would forge new chains. Give us strength to stand against evil and wisdom to know your path." Timothy's head bowed as she prayed, his own lips moving silently. The firelight cast long shadows on the wall, but Nancy felt something warm and solid growing in her heart. Not quite hope, but the beginning of courage. Outside, the wind whispered through bare branches, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. Inside the humble ranch house, two souls waited in the lamplight, knowing that tomorrow would bring its own battles, but facing them together. The gray light of false dawn crept across the frost-covered yard as Timothy hitched the horses to the wagon. His breath made clouds in the cold air while his fingers worked the familiar leather straps. The old mare nickered softly, her flanks steaming in the chill. Inside the kitchen, Nancy moved with quiet purpose. She wrapped cornbread and salt pork in clean cloth, tucking them carefully into a basket alongside dried apples and a jar of fresh water. Her worn Bible lay on the table, its pages softened by years of handling. After a moment's hesitation, she slipped it into her apron pocket. Kneading its familiar weight close to her heart, Timothy stepped into the warmth of the kitchen, stamping his boots. "Wagon's ready," he said, his voice rough with the morning. "Should make Austin in 4 days if the weather holds." Nancy handed him the basket, her fingers brushing his. "You'll need strength for the journey." She paused, wrestling with words. That seemed too big for her throat. "Be careful on the road." He nodded, understanding all she couldn't say. The journey to Austin wasn't just about distance. There were men who wouldn't take kindly to his mission. Men who believed certain truths were better left buried. "Keep the rifle loaded," he told her, checking his own revolver. "And the doors barred at night." "I will." She walked him to the porch, watching as he settled the basket in the wagon. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky pink as Timothy clicked to the horses. Nancy stood watching until the wagon disappeared around the bend, leaving only twin-wheel ruts in the frozen ground. The lump in her throat grew larger, but she swallowed it down. There was work to be done. The morning passed in familiar routine. She scattered feed for the chickens, their scratching and clucking a comfort in the empty yard. The cattle needed tending, their breath making fog in the cold air as they crowded the feed trough. Nancy kept moving, knowing that idle hands would only lead to worry. By afternoon, the house felt too quiet. She found herself listening for Timothy's cane on the porch steps, the creak of his chair by the fire. Instead, there was only the wind, rattling the shutters and the distant lowing of cattle. As dusk approached, new sounds emerged from the gathering shadows. The haunting yips of coyotes echoed across the pasture, drawing closer to the chicken coop. Nancy's heart quickened, but she refused to give in to fear. Grabbing the lantern, she strode out into the yard. The yellow eyes gleamed in the darkness, 3 pairs watching her from beyond the fence. Nancy raised the lantern high, her voice strong and steady. "Get on now! These ain't your chickens!" The coyotes hesitated, then slunk away into the night. Nancy stood guard until their yips faded into distance, the lantern light throwing her shadow long across the frozen ground. The next day brought unwelcome visitors of a different kind. Hoofbeats approached around noon, and Nancy looked up from her washing to see 3 riders approaching. She recognized them as hands from the Peterson ranch, men who'd sneered at her in church. They didn't speak, but their eyes held contempt as they passed. One spat in the dust. Another reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a stone, smooth and round as an egg. With deliberate slowness, he placed it on the fence post nearest the house. A warning, clear as any words could make it. Nancy's. Hands trembled as she hung the last sheet, but she refused to run inside. Instead, she began to sing, her voice carrying across the yard. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. The riders turned in their saddles, startled by her defiance. Nancy kept singing, each word a declaration of her right to exist in this space. They finally rode off, leaving the stone behind like a shadow on the fence. When night fell, Nancy brought the stone inside. She placed it on the mantel as a reminder, not of their hatred, but of her own strength in facing it, miles away. Timothy made his solitary camp beneath stars that seemed too bright and cold. He'd pushed the horses as far as he dared, making good time on the Austin road. Now in the quiet hours, he fed small sticks into his campfire, watching the flames dance against the darkness. The fire's glow painted shadows on his weathered face, deepening the lines carved there by war and hard years. His side ached where the shrapnel had torn into him at Shiloh, the old wound speaking up in the cold. He shifted, trying to find comfort on his bedroll. Sleep came in fits and starts, broken by dreams of cannon fire and screaming horses. In his dreams, the smoke was so thick he couldn't breathe, and Nancy's face appeared through the haze, reaching for him as chains dragged her away. He woke with a start, his hand clutching his side where the metal still lay buried in his flesh. The fire had burned low, and the night air bit through his blanket. Overhead, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human suffering. Timothy pushed himself up, grimacing at the stiffness in his joints. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten, though the sun itself was still well below the horizon. He moved carefully through the familiar motions of breaking camp, his hands remembering their work even in the dim light. The horses stood patiently as he hitched them, their backs steaming in the cold morning air. He checked their hooves for stones, ran gentle hands down their legs looking for heat or swelling. They would need their strength for the miles ahead. As he swung up onto the wagon seat, Timothy's thoughts turned to Nancy, alone at the ranch. He'd seen the steel in her spine, the quiet dignity that no amount of cruelty could bend. Still, he worried. The world was hard on those who stood alone, but there was no time for doubt now. The road to Austin stretched before him, and somewhere in that city lay the proof that would secure Nancy's freedom. Timothy gathered the reins and clicked to the horses, his jaw set with determination. The wagon rolled forward into the growing light, carrying its passenger toward whatever justice or danger waited ahead. Behind him, the campfire's ashes grew cold, and ahead, the sun began its slow climb into another uncertain day. The 4th morning of Timothy's journey dawned cold and clear. His breath frosted in the air as he guided the wagon through a narrow pass, tall pines crowding close on either side. The wheels crunched over fallen needles, the only sound besides the horse's steady breathing. Twigs snapped high on the ridge. Timothy's war-trained instincts screamed danger a heartbeat before hoofbeats thundered. Riders burst from the trees, their horses' flanks lathered with sweat. He recognized the brand on their saddles, Cade's men. The first shot cracked past his ear like summer lightning. Timothy threw himself from the wagon, hitting the ground hard as his bad leg buckled. He rolled behind a boulder, drawing his Colt single-action revolver in one fluid motion. The familiar weight steadied his hand. "Get him!" A voice shouted. More gunfire peppered the rocks around him. Timothy breathed slow, the way he'd learned in the war. Wait for the shot. Make each bullet count. When a rider leaned too far from his saddle, Timothy squeezed the trigger. The man cried out, clutching his shoulder as he tumbled from his horse. Hot lead screamed past Timothy's head. He shifted position, but not fast enough. Fire traced across his upper arm as a bullet found its mark. The graze wasn't deep, but blood soaked his sleeve, making his grip slick on the revolver. His horse reared in panic, breaking free from the wagon. The animal bolted down the pass, taking Timothy's supplies with it. The remaining riders, seeing their companion down, wheeled their mounts. Shots echoed as they retreated. Leaving their wounded man to crawl into the underbrush, Timothy slumped against the boulder, pressing his bandana against the wound. His leg throbbed where he'd landed on it. The wagon sat empty, one wheel splintered. By gunfire. Ahead lay miles of open country before the next settlement. He pushed himself upright, testing his weight on the bad leg. It held, barely. Timothy retrieved his canteen and what food he could carry from the wagon, then started walking. Each step sent pain shooting through his hip, but he kept moving. The sun climbed higher, baking the rocky ground dot by late afternoon. His steps had grown uneven, the limp more pronounced. Sweat soaked his shirt despite the cool air. Through blurring vision, he spotted smoke rising from a chimney, a homestead nestled in a protected valley. The farmer found Timothy at his gate, leaning heavily on the fence post. The man took one look at Timothy's bloody sleeve and weathered face and brought him inside. His wife cleaned and bandaged the wound while their children watched wide-eyed from the corner. "Cade's boys, I reckon," the farmer said, offering Timothy coffee. "Been causing trouble up and down the valley." Timothy nodded, warming his hands on the cup. "Need to reach Austin. Important papers waiting there." The farmer studied him, then nodded. "Got a fresh horse you can borrow. Good animal, sure-footed. Bring her back when you can." Timothy's throat tightened with gratitude. Much obliged. Back at the ranch, Nancy faced battles of her own. She'd hitched the wagon and driven into Mason Creek, needing flour and coffee. The general store owner watched her through narrowed eyes as she approached the counter. "Don't serve your kind here," he said, turning his back. Nancy stood straight, dignity wrapped around her like armor. She tried the dry goods store next, but the woman there pulled her daughter close and hurried into the back room. Door closed in her face. She was about to leave when someone touched her arm. Miss Sarah, the aging schoolteacher, gestured for Nancy to follow. Behind the schoolhouse, she pressed a sack of flour into Nancy's hands. "Been teaching 30 years, Miss Sarah whispered. "Right is right, no matter what others say." Nancy blinked back tears. "Thank you, ma'am." That evening, Nancy stood in Timothy's kitchen, measuring flour into her mother's biscuit recipe. She'd invited the ranch hands to supper 3 weather-beaten men who'd worked Timothy's land for years. They arrived with hats in hand, uncertain but hungry, the kitchen filled with warmth as Nancy set out beans, cornbread, and fresh coffee. The men shifted awkwardly until she smiled, gesturing them to sit. "Ain't had cooking this good since my mama's." Table. Joe, the oldest hand, sat around a mouthful of cornbread. Nancy settled in her chair, drawing out her Bible. "Anyone interested in learning some reading while we eat?" The men exchanged glances. Finally, young Tom cleared his throat. "Never had much schooling, ma'am, but I'd sure like to learn my letters." Nancy opened to Psalms, where the pages lay smooth. From Timothy's nightly readings. She pointed to simple words, helping them sound out each letter. Soon laughter mixed with their lessons as they stumbled over syllables together. "That there says mighty," Joe announced proudly, squinting at the page. "Sure does," Nancy smiled. "Like the mighty fine way you all work this land." The men beamed at her praise. For a few precious hours, the kitchen rang with warmth and fellowship. Nancy found herself relaxing, sharing stories as they ate. These men had known Timothy for years. They spoke of his fairness, his quiet strength. When the last plate was cleared, and the men had ridden out, Nancy's smile faded. The house felt empty again, Timothy's absence an ache in the quiet. She climbed the stairs to her room, joints tired from the day's work. Kneeling beside her narrow bed, Nancy clasped her hands. The words came soft but fierce in the darkness. "Lord, keep him safe on the road. Bring him home to this land that needs him. And give me strength to face whatever comes." She touched the Bible in her apron pocket, drawing comfort from its familiar shape. Somewhere out there, Timothy was fighting for her freedom. Here, she would hold fast to the home they were building, one day at a time. Outside her window, a whip-poor-will called into the night. Nancy lay down, pulling the quilt close against the chill. Her prayers followed Timothy down the long road. To Austin, carrying hope on their wings. The Austin courthouse loomed before Timothy, its limestone walls weathered by sun and storm. He climbed the steps slowly, his wounded arm still tender, his bad leg protesting each rise. Inside, the halls echoed with footsteps and desperate voices. Timothy joined the line at the records office, watching as person after person approached. The young clerk's desk. A freedman in threadbare clothes held out papers with trembling hands, begging to find his children. The clerk barely glanced up before sending him away. A veteran with an empty sleeve requested his pension documents. The clerk shuffled papers, claiming they were misplaced. Hours crept by. Timothy's leg ached from standing, but he wouldn't sit. He'd come too far to show weakness now. The wooden floorboards creaked under his boots as he shifted his weight. Finally, his turn came. The clerk, barely 20 with ink-stained fingers, peered at him through wire-rimmed glasses. "State your business," the young man drawled. "Need to verify a freedwoman's manumission papers. Name's Nancy." Timothy kept his voice steady, though exhaustion pulled at every word. The clerk's lip curled. That could take days, weeks even. "Records are disorganized." Timothy planted both hands on the desk, leaning forward. "Then I'll wait, right here." Something in his tone made the clerk glance up. Timothy's eyes held the hard look of a man who'd seen war, who wouldn't be turned aside by a boy's prejudice. "Very well," the clerk sighed. "Take a seat." Timothy stood instead, watching as the clerk disappeared into the records room. More hours dragged past. The courthouse slowly emptied as afternoon light slanted through tall windows. Timothy's wounded arm throbbed, but he kept his post. The clerk returned as shadows lengthened, carrying a leather-bound volume. He thumbed through pages with deliberate slowness. "Seems we do have something." He slid a document across the desk. "Proper manumission. Record, dated 1865. Official seal and all." Timothy's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the paper. There was Nancy's name, her freedom officially recorded and sealed. The document that would protect her from Cade's false claims. He pressed the paper to his chest, bowing his head in silence. "Thanks." The clerk watched with barely disguised contempt as Timothy carefully folded the document and tucked it into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. "Much obliged," Timothy said quietly, turning to leave. "Don't know why you trouble yourself," the clerk called after him. "For one of them." Timothy paused in the doorway but didn't look back. Some men weren't worth the breath of answering. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Nancy woke to the crackle of flames and the acrid smell of burning hay. She bolted upright in bed, her heart pounding. Orange light flickered through her window like hell's own sunrise. The hay barn was burning. Nancy ran outside in her nightdress, snow biting her bare feet. Flames roared through the barn's wooden walls, consuming the winter feed supply. Smoke billowed black against the star-filled sky. Without thinking, she grabbed a horse blanket from the fence and plunged it into the water trough. The wet wool. Heavy in her arms, she ran for the barn door. Inside, heat slapped her face like an open furnace. Smoke clawed at her lungs as she beat at the flames with the blanket. Burning hay rained down from the loft. Nancy choked, stumbling deeper into the inferno. "Miss Nancy!" Rough hands seized her shoulders, dragging her backward. "You can't save it." The ranch hands pulled her out just as a beam crashed down where she'd been standing. Nancy fought their grip, reaching toward the barn until her legs gave way. She collapsed in the snow, coughing up black smoke. Joe, the oldest hand, wrapped his coat around her shoulders while the others formed a bucket line. But they all knew it was futile. The barn was beyond saving. Through streaming eyes, Nancy saw a lone rider on the ridge, outlined against the flames. Cade Broderick sat his horse like a king surveying his domain. He tipped his hat mockingly before wheeling his mount away into the darkness. The barn burned until dawn, leaving only smoking ruins and the bitter stench of ash. Nancy stood in the wreckage, snow soaking through her boots. Without the winter feed, the cattle would suffer. Some might die before spring. It was a cruel blow aimed at the heart of the ranch's survival. That evening, Nancy sat alone in her room, her throat still raw from smoke. She opened her Bible with trembling fingers, touching the papers hidden within its worn cover. Documents she'd never shown anyone, not even Timothy. Proof of her past, her family, her freedom too precious to risk losing. She slid the papers deeper between the pages of Psalms, where they'd stayed safe through all her journeys. Then she held the Bible close, rocking slightly as she whispered prayers into the gathering dark. Beyond her window, snow began to fall, covering the blackened ruins of the barn in a blank white shroud. Somewhere on the long road from Austin, Timothy was riding home, carrying his own precious paper. Nancy prayed it would be enough to keep her safe, to keep them both safe, but as she touched her throat, still tasting smoke, she knew Cade wouldn't stop with burning barns. This was just the beginning of his revenge. The ranch hands huddled in their bunkhouse, keeping watch through the night. Nancy banked the stove fire and checked every window latch. In the empty house, she felt Timothy's absence like a physical ache, but she wouldn't run. This land had become home, its soil worked by honest hands, its boundaries marked by truth rather than power. Nancy tucked her Bible under her pillow, feeling the hidden papers crinkle. She'd survived bondage and brutality. With God's help, she would survive this too. Outside, the snow fell thicker, erasing tracks and smoothing rough edges. Nancy lay awake, listening to the wind keen through empty barn beams, waiting for morning to show what strength remained to face whatever came next. Timothy's wagon creaked through the ranch gate 3 days after the fire. His heart sank at the sight of the blackened ruins where the hay barn had stood. Smoke still curled from charred beams, and the bitter scent of ash hung heavy in the winter air. Nancy emerged from the house, her shawl pulled tight against the cold. Their eyes met across the yard, speaking volumes without words. Timothy climbed down stiffly, his injured arm protesting, and crossed to her in long strides. "Thank the Lord you're safe," he said hoarsely, pulling her close. Nancy trembled. Against him, her composure finally breaking after days of staying strong alone. "Cade," she whispered. He watched it burn. Timothy's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice gentle. "We'll rebuild," he murmured into her hair. Together. They surveyed the damage, boots crunching through snow and ash. The winter feed was gone, along with tools and tack. But the foundation stones still stood firm, and some of the support beams might be salvaged. "Reckon we can save these posts," Timothy said, testing a blackened timber. "Cut away the burned portions. Use what sound." Nancy nodded, already rolling up her sleeves. They worked through the morning, Timothy prying loose scorched boards while Nancy sorted through debris, setting aside anything useful. The ranch hands joined them, forming a line to clear away rubble. The freezing wind cut through their clothes, but the work kept them warm. Nancy's quick eye spotted iron fixtures they could reuse, while Timothy's carpenter's knowledge showed where they might shore up weakened sections. By sunset, they had a pile of salvageable materials and a plan for rebuilding. Over supper, Timothy spread out the manumission papers he'd brought from Austin. "These'll protect you proper now," he said. "Legal proof you're free." Nancy touched the documents with reverent fingers. "The Lord provides," she whispered. 2 days later, riders came through announcing a revival meeting in town. Timothy watched Nancy's face tighten with anxiety at the news. "We should go," he said quietly that evening. Nancy shook her head. "After what happened at church? They don't want my kind there." "The Spirit moves where it will," Timothy replied, "and you've got as much right to worship as any soul." The revival tent rose like a canvas mountain on the edge of town, lanterns swaying from poles in the crisp night air. Timothy helped Nancy down from the wagon, noting how she squared her shoulders before walking in. Inside, the crowd pressed close, their breath visible in the winter chill. Some folks stiffened when Timothy and Nancy entered, but others nodded. "Greeting." They found seats near the back, where the canvas walls rippled in the wind. The preacher called for hymns, and voices lifted in familiar tunes. During a lull between songs, he asked if anyone had a special testimony to share. Timothy felt Nancy straighten beside him. Slowly, she rose to her feet. Her voice came soft at first, trembling like a candle flame. The spiritual was one Timothy had never heard before, its melody ancient and haunting. As Nancy gained confidence, her voice swelled, filling the tent with power and grace. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." The crowd fell silent, caught by the raw emotion in her singing. The song spoke of chains broken, of darkness turned to light, of hope rising from despair. Tears gleamed on weathered faces. Even the preacher stood transfixed. When the last note faded, silence held for a heartbeat. Then Deacon Samuel Hollis rose slowly from his seat, his gray head bowed. "That's the voice of God's child," he declared, voice carrying clear through the tent. "No chains can bind it. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. The preacher called for an amen, and voices responded with growing enthusiasm. Nancy sank back down, her cheeks wet with tears. More people sang after that, but something had shifted in the tent. When the service ended, folks stopped to shake Nancy's hand to thank her for the blessing of her song. Women who had turned away in the store now smiled and nodded. Children stared with open wonder instead of fear. On the ride home, stars blazed across the winter sky like scattered diamonds. Nancy sat close to Timothy, their shoulders touching. "Thank you," she said softly, "for making me come tonight." "Wasn't me," Timothy replied. "Was the Lord's doing." Nancy laughed then, a gentle sound that made Timothy's heart lift. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh, sweet as spring water after drought. She leaned against him as the wagon rolled on, both of them warm despite the cold night air. The northern star gleamed steady above them, guiding them home. Timothy felt Nancy's quiet happiness beside him, precious as a rare flower blooming in winter. This was what he'd fought for in the war, he realized, not just freedom on paper, but moments like this. The right of every soul to laugh under God's stars without fear. The wagon wheels squeaked through fresh snow as they approached the ranch. Ahead lay much work, rebuilding the barn, facing down Cade's threats, winning acceptance from more of the town. But tonight had shown that hearts could change. That music could open doors that force could not break. Nancy hummed softly as they neared home, her voice carrying peace into the night. Timothy smiled, knowing that together they could face whatever. Tomorrow might bring. Dawn crept soft and golden over Timothy's ranch, painting the frost-covered grass in shades of honey. The morning after the revival meeting carried a different feel, as if the acceptance shown under the canvas tent had somehow followed them home, wrapping the homestead in tentative peace. Peace. Nancy stood at the iron cook stove, her hands moving with practiced grace as she poured batter onto the hot surface. The kitchen filled with the homey scent of flapjacks and coffee. Through the window, she watched Timothy working in the corral, his figure outlined against the rising sun as he hammered loose boards back into place. The evening's hymn still echoed in her mind, bringing a small smile to her face. She had felt something shift in that tent, a crack in the wall of prejudice that had seemed so solid before. Even Mrs. Peterson, who had refused to sell her flour last week, had squeezed her hand after the service. She flipped the last flapjack onto the warming plate just as Timothy's boots scraped on the porch. But before he could reach the door, the thunder of hooves broke the morning quiet. Nancy's heart stuttered as she recognized the sheriff's bay mare among the approaching riders. Timothy stood his ground on the porch as Sheriff Greeley dismounted, followed by Cade Broderick and 2 deputies. The sheriff's face was pinched with discomfort as he pulled a paper from his vest. "Timothy Townsend," he called out, his voice carrying through the crisp air. "Got here a warrant for your arrest." Nancy's hands gripped the doorframe as she stepped outside. Timothy remained still, his expression carefully neutral. "The charge?" he asked quietly. "Harboring stolen property," the sheriff replied, not meeting his eyes. "And interfering with rightful ownership claims." "She ain't property," Timothy said, his voice level but firm. "She's a free woman." Cade's laugh cut sharp as a whip crack. "That's for the court to decide." He nodded to his deputies. "Take him." Timothy's shoulders straightened as the deputies approached with shackles. Nancy started forward, a cry rising in her throat, but Timothy's gentle headshake stopped her. "No need for trouble," he told the deputies, holding out his wrists. The iron cuffs clicked shut with horrible finality. "Timothy, please," Nancy whispered, her voice breaking. "Don't let them. It'll be all right," he assured her, though his eyes betrayed his worry. "Truth will stand." The deputies led him to their horses, where a third mount waited. Nancy watched helplessly as they helped him awkwardly into the saddle, his hands bound before him. Cade wheeled his stallion closer to the porch, looming over Nancy with a practiced sneer. "Best start packing your things, girl. Time to come back where you belong." Nancy lifted her chin, meeting his gaze despite her trembling. "I belong to no man but God." "We'll see about that," Cade drawled. He touched the brim of his hat in mock courtesy before turning his horse to follow the deputies. Nancy stood rooted to the porch as the riders disappeared down the road, Timothy's bowed figure growing smaller until the morning mist swallowed them all. Only then did she let her tears fall, hot tracks freezing on her cheeks in the winter air. The house felt hollow as a tomb when she finally went back inside. The flapjack sat cold on the plate, breakfast forgotten. Nancy sank into Timothy's chair at the table, her mind whirling with fear and grief. But beneath the terror, something else stirred, a steel-hard determination she had not felt since running from her last master Dot as evening drew its purple shadows across the land. Nancy lit a single candle. Its flame danced on the worn table, as she carefully extracted her Bible from its hiding place. With trembling fingers, she worked at the hidden stitches in the cover, drawing out the precious papers Timothy had brought from Austin. The manumission document lay pristine before her, its official seal gleaming in the candlelight. She traced the letters of her name, remembering Timothy's quiet joy when he had shown it to her. This paper, this proof of her humanity, could save them both. Through the night, Nancy kept vigil with her candle and her proof of freedom. Read and reread the document until every word was branded in her memory. As the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern sky, she knew what she had to do. Morning found her in the barn, her hands sure despite their shaking as she harnessed the wagon team. The horses shifted restlessly, sensing her tension, but stood steady as she checked each strap and buckle. Timothy had taught her well. Nancy climbed onto the driver's seat, settling her skirts around her. The manumission papers lay secure in her pocket, pressed close to her heart. Fear clutched at her throat as she took up the reins, fear of the road ahead, of the courthouse filled with white men's law, of Cade's cruel power. But Timothy's faith in her gave her strength, and God's presence wrapped around her like a shield. Wagon wheels crunched through the frost as Nancy turned toward town. She sat straight-backed on the seat, her chin high despite the terror fluttering in her chest. The road to the county courthouse stretched long before her, but she would not turn back. Timothy had risked everything to protect her freedom. Now, it was her turn to fight for his. The morning sun climbed higher as the wagon rolled on, its light catching the cross hanging from Nancy's neck, the one Timothy had given her after the revival. Its warm metal reminded her of his gentle strength, of his unwavering belief in truth's power over lies. Ahead lay the courthouse with its stern facade and marble steps, where she would have to stand alone before the law. But Nancy held tight to her courage and her proof of freedom, trusting in God's justice even when man's justice failed. The wagon wheels turned steadily onward as she drove toward her destiny, toward Timothy's freedom, toward the truth that would break their chains. Once and for all, the wagon wheels rattled over Mason Creek's uneven streets as Nancy guided the team through town. Morning sun glinted off frost-covered windows, but the warmth did little to ease her racing heart. Townsfolk stopped in their tracks, staring openly as she passed. Some whispered behind raised hands while others turned their backs completely. Nancy kept her spine straight, though her hands trembled on the reins. Her Bible lay beside her on the seat, its precious contents pressed between well-worn pages. The courthouse loomed ahead, its weathered limestone walls stretching toward the winter sky. As she drew the wagon to a halt, Martha Wilson, the aging schoolteacher, hurried down the courthouse steps. Her gray hair had escaped its pins, and worry creased her kind face. "Child," she said softly, helping Nancy down from the wagon, "I heard about Timothy's arrest." "Are you all right?" Nancy clutched her Bible closer. "I have to help him, Miss Martha. He's in there because of me." "You're not alone," Martha assured her, squeezing her arm. "Come with me." They climbed the courthouse steps together, their boots clicking against stone. Inside, the air hung heavy with tobacco smoke and the musty scent of old papers. Nancy's heart thundered so loud she was certain everyone could hear it. A movement caught her eye. John Red Cloud, the half-Comanche rancher whose wife Nancy had nursed through fever last month, stepped from the shadows. His dark eyes held understanding. As he nodded to her, "I remember kindness," he said simply. "I will speak truth about the good man Timothy is and how you have helped my people when others turned away." Tears pricked Nancy's eyes at his words. Before she could respond, another voice joined them, "As will I." Deacon Samuel Hollis stood in the doorway, his aged face set with determination. "That hymn you sang at revival, it opened my eyes to see God's truth clear as day. No slave could sing with such holy joy. You're as free as any of us, child." Nancy's hands trembled as she opened her Bible, carefully withdrawing the manumission papers. I have proof, she whispered, showing them the official seal. Timothy rode to Austin himself to get these papers. Martha studied the documents, nodding. Firmly, these will help. But first, you should see him. He's being held below. The jail cells occupied the courthouse basement, dark and damp despite the morning sun. A deputy led Nancy down worn stone steps, keys jingling at his belt. The musty air closed around her like a shroud. Timothy sat on a narrow cot, his hands still shackled. His familiar figure, bound in iron, made Nancy's heart clench. But when he looked up, his eyes held the same steady kindness she had come to. Trust. Nancy, he breathed, rising unsteadily. She rushed to the bars, reaching through to press her palm against his calloused hand. The touch anchored her, giving her strength. I'll bring you home, she whispered fiercely. I have the papers. And friends who'll stand with us. Trust in God's mercy. Timothy's fingers tightened around hers. I trust in him, he said softly, and in you. The deputy cleared his throat, signaling their time was up. Nancy reluctantly withdrew her hand, but her voice stayed strong. Hold fast to hope. Justice will come. That evening, Martha Wilson opened her home to Nancy, offering a small guest room overlooking the street. Nancy sat on the narrow bed, unable to find rest despite her exhaustion. The weight of tomorrow's testimony pressed heavy on her mind. Through the thin walls she could hear Martha moving about, preparing for bed. The schoolteacher had spent hours helping Nancy practice what to say in court, how to present the manumission papers, how to stand firm against Cade's likely accusations. In his cell across town, Timothy paced his confined space, 3 steps each way. The darkness pressed close, stirring memories of war, cannon fire, screaming horses, the copper taste of fear. He sank onto his cot, despair threatening to overwhelm him. Then, carried on the night wind, a sound reached through his barred window. Nancy's voice, clear and strong, lifted in an old spiritual about deliverance. The familiar words wrapped around him like a warm blanket. Wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Timothy bowed his head, tears tracking silently down his weathered cheeks. But they were tears of hope now, not despair. Nancy's faith reached across the darkness. Rekindling his own dot in Martha's guest room, Nancy continued singing softly into the night, her voice carrying strength to Timothy and prayer to heaven. The moon rose over Mason Creek, casting silver light. Through both windows, the barred cell and the humble bedroom, connecting them in spirit, though bars and boundaries kept them apart. Martha Wilson listened from her room, her heart aching for both of them. She had taught in Mason Creek for 30 years, watching prejudice poison good people's hearts. But Nancy's courage and Timothy's quiet strength gave her hope that change was possible. John Red Cloud, riding home to his family, heard Nancy's song floating on the wind. He touched the medicine pouch at his throat, offering a prayer to the Great Spirit for justice to prevail. His people knew too well how the law could be twisted by men like Cade Broderick. In his own fine house on the hill, Deacon Hollis sat at his desk, penning careful notes for his testimony. The revival hymn Nancy had sung still echoed in his memory, convicting him of times he had chosen comfort over courage. Tomorrow he would choose differently. The night deepened toward dawn as Nancy's voice finally stilled. She lay down fully dressed, one hand resting on her Bible. Tomorrow would bring its own battles. But tonight she had done what she could, reminded Timothy he wasn't alone, gathered allies for the fight ahead, and lifted her prayers to the God who saw all hearts clearly. In his cell, Timothy finally found rest, Nancy's song still humming in his soul. The darkness no longer felt so heavy. Tomorrow would test them all, but tonight, faith and love had built a bridge stronger than iron bars and stone walls. Morning light filtered through the courthouse's tall windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The benches creaked under the weight of what seemed like half of Mason Creek's population. The air hung thick with whispers and the musty scent of old law books. Nancy sat straight-backed in the front row, her Bible clutched tight in trembling hands. Timothy, still in manacles, was led to the defendant's chair. His face showed fresh bruises, but his eyes remained steady, finding Nancy's across the room. Cade Broderick strutted through the center aisle like a rooster in his Sunday best, tipping his hat to influential ranchers. His boots clicked against the floorboards as he made his way to the front. The sheriff stood near him, shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot, his badge catching the morning light. Judge Harrison, gray-haired and stern-faced, called the court to order. The sharp rap of his gavel cut through the murmurs. This court will hear the matter of ownership regarding one Nancy, claimed as property by Mr. Cade Broderick, the judge announced, his voice carrying to the rafters. Cade stepped forward, producing his papers with a flourish. Your Honor, these documents clearly show my rightful claim. This woman is my property, stolen by Timothy Townsend. The sheriff nodded, though his eyes wouldn't meet anyone's gaze. The papers appear proper, Judge. As law enforcement, I must support Mr. Broderick's claim. Martha Wilson squeezed Nancy's hand as whispers rustled through the crowd. John Red Cloud stood silent against the back wall, his dark eyes watchful. Deacon Hollis sat with his hands folded, prayer-like. The defense may present its case, Judge Harrison declared. Nancy rose slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. The floor seemed to sway beneath her feet as she walked forward. The crowd's stares pressed against her like physical weight. But she remembered Timothy's words about truth being stronger than scorn. She lifted her Bible, its leather worn smooth by years of faith. With careful fingers, she opened the special pocket she'd sewn into the cover, withdrawing the papers Timothy had brought from Austin. The official seal caught the sunlight as she held them up. I am not a virgin, she declared, her voice starting soft but growing stronger with each word. I am not a slave. I am a woman, free before God and man. She placed the manumission record on the judge's desk. These papers prove it. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like wind through wheat. Cade's face darkened to a dangerous red as he sputtered, That's impossible. I have the only valid claim. The young clerk from Austin, summoned by telegram, stepped forward. Your Honor, I can testify that these are genuine freedom papers, properly filed and sealed by the state of Texas. I personally helped Mr. Townsend locate them in our records. Judge Harrison studied both sets of documents carefully, holding them up to the light. His frown deepened as he examined Cade's papers, then Nancy's. Timothy struggled to his feet, chains rattling. Your Honor, if I may speak? The judge nodded. Nancy is my family, Timothy said, his quiet voice carrying clear through the hushed room. By choice, not by purchase. No man can own another in God's eyes. Deacon Hollis stood then, his aged voice strong? I've seen the truth of their character, Your Honor. At our revival meeting, this woman's voice lifted prayers that could only come from a free soul. John Red Cloud stepped forward. She has shown kindness to my people when others wouldn't. Such generosity comes not from bondage but from a free heart. The judge held up his hand for silence. He compared the papers once more, then straightened in his chair. These papers presented by Mr. Broderick show clear signs of forgery, he announced. The dates are impossible, and the seal is false. He turned a stern gaze on Cade. This court finds you guilty of attempted fraud, Mr. Broderick. You will pay a fine of $500, and count yourself fortunate I don't order jail time. The courtroom erupted. Some of Cade's supporters shouted in outrage, but they were drowned out by applause from others. Martha Wilson wept openly, while John Red Cloud smiled slightly, touching his medicine pouch. Cade's face twisted with rage. He stormed toward the door, shoving past onlookers. This isn't finished, he snarled, but jeers followed him out. The judge rapped his gavel again. Sheriff, remove Mr. Townsend's chains. He is free to go. He smiled slightly at Nancy. And miss, your freedom is hereby affirmed by this court. Let no man challenge it again. The deputy unlocked Timothy's shackles. As they fell away, Nancy rushed forward. Timothy caught her in his arms, holding her close as relief flooded through them both. Her tears dampened his shirt while his hands trembled against her back. Thank you, Lord, she whispered against his chest. Thank you for bringing us home. The morning sun streamed stronger now through the courthouse windows, touching their embracing figures with gold. Around them, supporters gathered close, Martha Wilson dabbing her eyes, John Red Cloud offering a quiet blessing, Deacon Hollis beaming like a proud father. Timothy guided the wagon down the familiar dirt track toward home, Nancy's hand warm in his. They crested the hill together, facing the blackened skeleton of the barn against the setting sun. His jaw tightened at the sight, But Nancy squeezed his fingers gently. Before they could begin clearing debris, wagon wheels creaked behind them. Deacon Hollis appeared, carrying a box of tools. The schoolteacher, Martha Wilson, followed with bread and nails. More neighbors trickled in, heads lowered in shame but hands ready to work. The preacher arrived last, his hat twisted between worried fingers. "Miss Nancy," he stammered, "I've come to ask forgiveness." Nancy's voice was soft but strong. "Join." "U.S. for supper, Reverend." That evening, beans and bread passed around the fire as Nancy's clear voice lifted in song. Children from nearby farms joined in, their sweet voices filling Timothy's home with joy. He watched Nancy leading them, her face glowing in the firelight. Later, as stars emerged, Timothy took her hand. "My war scars," he whispered. "They don't weigh so heavy when you're near." Snow drifted like delicate lace across the Texas hills as evening settled over the ranch. In the warm kitchen, lamplight pooled across worn wooden floors while Nancy's voice carried the ancient words of comfort. Ranch hands and children from neighboring farms sat cross-legged, hanging on every word as she read from her beloved Bible. Timothy rocked slowly in his chair, a half-carved piece of wood in his weathered hands. His eyes never left Nancy's face, seeing in her the answer to years of loneliness. After the children had gone, their bootsteps fading into the winter night, Timothy moved to Nancy's side. "I never asked you to be anything but yourself," he whispered tenderly. Nancy's eyes glistened as she placed her hand in his. Though the wind howled fierce beyond their walls, their home glowed with newfound warmth. This place, once hollow with solitude, now rang with faith and family, two souls healed by love's patient grace. If something in this story whispered to your spirit, stay a while, subscribe, and come back tomorrow. The next story may be the one you didn't know you needed.